Hi, Colonel McGregor. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
That's good. So there's quite a lot going on, but with Ukraine, obviously, and Russia. But I want to start by saying I'm really glad to have you back because it seems like you've been right about everything, including Nord Stream, thanks to Sy Hersh.
Well, I suppose that's true, although it's unfortunate. I wish I had been wrong.
Yeah, I know. Sometimes I feel like I'm in bizarro world and I actually purposely avoid some of the news on Ukraine on some days because I get so frustrated that none of what's happening actually reflects my worldview. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about was that, I guess a week or so ago, the approved mantra about Ukraine was as long as it takes. And 88 million people connected to the Biden administration and elsewhere in the world were saying that phrase exactly the same way. Could you explain for me how you think that happens? I mean, it might be a silly question, but do they get a memo or something from their diplomat saying this is our position and you must say it this way? It was really weird.
Well, you have to look at the people who are in charge across the West, whether it's Washington or Berlin, Paris, London. All of these people are part of a class of political figures who have embraced this notion of globalism. And I would add to that the dangerous notion that they are somehow or another morally superior to everyone else and therefore have a right to demand that the rest of the world do as they say, to put it bluntly. This is not a new phenomenon for us. We've been through this sort of nonsense before. The easiest example I can come up with is, of course, Vietnam, where we embarked on what we insisted was this morally justified crusade to throw back the forces of communism. Of course, we today don't talk about that, but we had someone else named John F. Kennedy who told everyone we should be prepared to bear any burden, to go anywhere and fight anybody in the name of freedom and democracy for the whole world. Well, that leads directly to Lyndon Baines Johnson, who then subsequently tells us we have to fight the communists in South Vietnam or we'll be fighting them in Los Angeles. Of course, a little later on in Iraq and Afghanistan, we heard people say the same things. If we don't fight the Islamists here, we'll be fighting them in the United States. And now we're hearing something very similar, that if we do not fight the evil Russians who are bent on conquering Europe, which of course is a lot of nonsense, then we'll eventually have to fight them in Poland and Germany and perhaps even here. This is the sort of thing that people that know nothing at all about what's happening will eagerly ingest and believe unless there is a counter narrative. And what's happened this time, in contrast to the Vietnam period, is there is no counter narrative. Yeah. I mean, the media is universally controlled by the same people who control your governments, control the financial markets, and entertainment. They are all part of the same class, and they are committed to this sort of Trotskyite vision of the world where there's perpetual revolutionary war to advance their aims. The truth of the matter is none of us share their aims. We're not interested in homogenizing the world and turning it into some sort of Sovietized entity. I mean, a lot of people talk about these leaders as fascists. I think that's very misleading. I think, in fact, you're talking about this Trotskyite mentality that says we're going to erase borders. We're going to destroy national identity. We're going to eliminate individual cultures. We're going to forcibly homogenize the world, create new people. The notion that, people are fungible. And this is all bound up with a very strong atheist creed, that there is nothing beyond this world. And therefore, what we do is ultimately irrelevant if we do it in the name of what we say is good and moral. And that's defined by these globalist views. That's the best way I can put it. But as long as you have a media that is 100% on board with these aims, how do you get it? How do you get an alternative view of the world? You've got to go search for it. You've got to go on to alternative media. People have to listen to people like you, Trish, and others in the United States who are unwilling to broadcast this sort of uninterrupted flow of lies and fiction.
That is really well said, because especially the point where you talked about this homogeneity that they're looking for, which, and maybe it's just because I'm a person of a certain age, right? I'm old. And I see various national identities slipping away in the face of this kind of monolithic globalism. And if you fight back against it, you're considered a far right populist racist, right? That is the script now. If you say, well, I would like to protect a little bit of this part of Canada or a little bit of this part of Germany or England, whatever, right? You're that's not allowed. It's actually a bad thing. And it frightens me because I feel that a world I knew so well is now slipping away, and I have no control over that at all. None.
Well, you recall that I was involved in the events that led ultimately to our intervention, first in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then subsequently to the Kosovo Air Campaign. And I remember sitting across from members of the Clinton administration and their State Department and listening to people say, well, there's no difference between Croats and Serbs and Slovenes. That's all nonsense. Or Muslims. All these people are essentially the same. Their languages aren't that different. Their cultures aren't that. They're really all the same. And I looked at this person and I said, well, you're certainly free to think that. But the people that live here don't share your view. The Serbs actually think they matter. They actually think their way of life, their culture, their religion, their language matter. So do the Croats. So do the Muslims. And it was interesting during the Dayton talks that there were all of these efforts to try and persuade the United States that its forces and the forces of Great Britain and France should all join together to force all of these people that had just fought a very bloody civil war to reintegrate and live with each other. I mean, can you imagine anything more bizarre? Well, Ambassador Holbrooke was in charge of the talks, and ultimately Holbrooke came to the right conclusion that's an impossibility. Can't be done. And we don't want to fight another war for 20 years, forcing people to live with each other who don't want to. And so you came up with an imperfect solution, but one which essentially assigned the Croats, the Serbs, and the Bosniaks, or Muslim Bosniaks, their respective tribal homelands. And as a result, we did eventually get peace, and it's held up reasonably well. We never thought it would hold up for as long as it has, to be blunt. Then we went through the same sort of nonsense in Kosovo. We're going to force these Serbs, and they're going to eat this, and that's the way it has to be, and this is the new world. And they would talk about diversity, but Trish, it had nothing to do with diversity. I'm a big believer in diversity. I always loved Europe because Europe was so diverse. It was a fascinating place. It was endlessly interesting to me. These people are not about diversity. They're about homogenization.
Yeah.
And it's very destructive. It's not going to work. It won't work in Ukraine. It's not going to work with the Russians. Russia is an ethno-based state. It is primarily Russian in culture, language, largely in ethnicity, though the Russians freely admit and celebrate the fact that they have people on their soil who are not Russians, who have long relationships with the Tsarist Russia, then subsequently under the Soviet leadership, and then today. So that's why you have thousands of people from Chechnya, other parts of the Caucasus, Tartars from places that we don't even know in the Urals and in Siberia, all of whom have flocked to fight shoulder to shoulder with the Russians for their common homeland. So this is a very dangerous thing that we're involved in because it hasn't worked. Hasn't worked anywhere. I don't think it will. But no one will stop. This narrative is deeply rooted in Washington, D.C. By the way, I can't imagine anybody in Canada going to war to stop the French from speaking French or from celebrating their origins, their culture, their way of life. I mean, that's part of Canada, is it not?
Well, it took a minute for us to figure it out, but yeah, now it's entrenched. And I remember when we were being encouraged to speak French by law. I mean, that's how old I am. And of course, my father was completely against it. He didn't understand it, but there was a bit of a scuffle. But now that it's here, everybody loves being this bilingual and bicultural country the way we are. It takes a minute, for people to sort of get it. But now that we've got it, we love it. Let me ask you this question about, because you alluded to it, about what the alignment is now. Globally, what is the alignment? China is now backing Russia. vocally. Is that correct?
I think it's important to understand a couple of things. You know, of course, that the Chinese recently submitted a peace proposal.
I actually didn't know that. I did not know that. I didn't know that.
They submitted a peace proposal, and it was summarily dismissed by Washington, out of hand, as well as London. Absolutely not. Wow. And the keystone in this edifice was, first and foremost, let's have a ceasefire. Let's halt along the lines of contact where we are. Let's hold talks. And then some discussion of potentially changing boundaries and so forth. Well, all of this was dismissed out of hand. We clung to this fiction that the boundaries created by Khrushchev back in the 1950s and his predecessor Lenin were somehow or another meaningful. No one was willing to do what needed to be done, which is to look at historic Ukraine and historic Russia, to look at where the people in these countries lived. And then, of course, the Ukrainians that took over in 2014, the people that we installed decided that they were going to Ukrainianize everyone inside their borders. Well, when you have almost a third of your population that is Russian in culture and language, and you say you can no longer be Russian in culture and language, if you want to live in this country, you have to embrace Ukrainianization. What kind of a response do you think you're going to get? A very negative one. Well, the Chinese simply said, let's stop, let's talk, let's review all of this. But we wouldn't even touch it. Well, at that point, if you're Chinese and you recognize that the Americans and the British in particular will have nothing to do with you, then you say, well, I suppose at this stage, I really do need to support the Russians, because clearly if the West is successful, though it seems very unlikely, in destroying Russia, we are probably next on the menu. And I think that's what's happened. The Chinese have decided that. Now, keep something else in mind, that from the very beginning of this conflict, Putin in particular and his government have been very sensitive to the views of the war held in places like Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, as well as China and Northeast Asia. And he has bent over backwards to ensure that whatever the Russians did, they minimized collateral damage, and they proceeded cautiously and slowly with the goal of minimizing human losses. In other words, the Russians have behaved in exactly the opposite way that the Ukrainians insist. On the other hand, the Ukrainians have really prosecuted terrible crimes against the Russians, terrible atrocities. Well, my point is that Putin looks at the rest of the world beyond Europe and the United States and says it matters. And indeed, he's right. It matters very much what people in India, what people in China think, what people in Japan think, what people in Central Africa think. He's sensitive to that and has moved very intelligently to ensure that he holds some credibility there, but more important, that he holds their loyalty, at least in terms of opinion. And I think that's worked very well. We don't seem to care. And we keep telling everybody the whole world is with us. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Once you get past Europe and the United States, there's razor thin support for what we're doing to Russia.
Well, I'm just wondering how many people in NATO are sticking, right? People are peeling off in NATO, aren't they?
Oh, behind the scenes, it's deeply divided. Are you kidding? I mean, the Germans right now, there's a quiet sense of rage growing inside the German electorate. They're beginning to figure out that this entire campaign that we've been waging against Russia is not only against Russia, it's against them. I mean, destroying this Nord Stream pipeline was a catastrophic error. We no longer were urging the Germans not to become too reliant on the Russians, which was always the warning. And of course, the Germans never accepted that because they saw no evidence and still see no evidence that the Russians are interested in going to war with them under any circumstances. On the contrary, the Germans will be the first to tell you the Russians want desperately to do business with them in the West. So that was part of it. But then we decided that we would usurp their sovereignty. We would make the decision for them. We would end any further commerce with natural gas, oil, petroleum products, and so forth by destroying this Nord Stream 2. That's effectively an act of war against both Russia and Germany. And Germans now feel it. They understand what's been going on. They understand what we're doing. Now, I don't know where that's going to leave, but I rather expect that we're going to see a change in this government, because the Germans were extremely unhappy with this Foreign Minister Baerbock's comment that Europe is at war with Russia. We in Germany are at war with Russia. The average German is horrified at that prospect, looks up and says,